When my son asked for my house papers, I did not feel fear. I felt proud. I remember smiling that day. I remember thinking, my son is finally taking responsibility. He said it was only for safety, just to keep them in one place, just in case something happened to me. I trusted him. I never imagined that 3 months later I would be sleeping outside that same house with my back against a cold wall, watching the lights glow inside as if I no longer existed. This is not a story about anger. It is not about shouting or fighting. It is a story about silence, about quiet choices, and about how love can slowly turn into loneliness without anyone noticing. I am a mother. Like many mothers, I believed love was enough. I believed that if I gave everything, I would never be left with nothing. I was wrong. That house was not just walls and bricks. It was my life. I built it slowly, year by year, one room at a time, one sacrifice at a time. Some years I skipped new clothes. Some years I skipped festivals. Some years I skipped rest, but I never skipped hope. I raised my son there. I watched him take his first steps on that floor. I fed him in that kitchen. I prayed for him in that small room near the window. Every corner knew my voice. When my son asked for my house papers, I did not feel fear. I felt proud. I remember smiling that day. I remember thinking, my son is finally taking responsibility. He said it was only for safety, just to keep them in one place, just in case something happened to me. I trusted him. I never imagined that 3 months later I would be sleeping outside that same house with my back against a cold wall, watching the lights glow inside as if I no longer existed. This is not a story about anger. It is not about shouting or fighting. It is a story about silence, about quiet choices, and about how love can slowly turn into loneliness without anyone noticing. I am a mother. Like many mothers, I believed love was enough. I believed that if I gave everything, I would never be left with nothing. I was wrong. That house was not just walls and bricks. It was my life. I built it slowly, year by year, one room at a time, one sacrifice at a time. Some years I skipped new clothes. Some years I skipped festivals. Some years I skipped rest, but I never skipped hope. I raised my son there. I watched him take his first steps on that floor. I fed him in that kitchen. I prayed for him in that small room near the window. Every corner knew my voice. After my husband passed away, the house became quieter. But my son stayed with me then. He was gentle. He was caring. Or maybe I just wanted to believe that. When he got married, I welcomed my daughter-in-law with an open heart. I gave her the master bedroom. I moved my things to the smaller room. I told myself, this is how families stay together. At first, everything was fine. We ate together. We talked in the evenings. Sometimes we laughed. But slowly, things changed. Not loudly, not suddenly, quietly. She stopped asking me what I wanted. She started deciding. The kitchen felt different. The silence felt heavier. My son still spoke kindly, but less often. I noticed things, but I ignored them, because mothers often do that. We tell ourselves it is normal. We tell ourselves we are imagining things. One afternoon, my son sat beside me. He did not look at my face. He said, "Ma, where are the house papers?" I told him where they were, inside the old metal box, under my clothes. He nodded. Then he said, "It's better if I keep them with me, just for safety." His voice was calm, normal, so I agreed. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. I did not know why. Something felt unsettled, but I pushed the feeling away. Trust is easy when you love deeply. I did not know that moment was the beginning of my disappearance, not from the house, but from their minds. Days passed, then weeks. The respect in small things faded. My cup was moved, my seat was taken, my voice became unnecessary. Still, I stayed quiet because I believed silence would protect peace. I did not know silence can also erase you. The day I was told to leave, there was no shouting, no argument, just one sentence, spoken softly, as if it meant nothing. And yet, it changed everything. But that part of the story comes later. For now, remember this. Sometimes the people who promise safety are the ones who take the ground from under your feet. I remember the house as it was before everything began to shift. It wasn't a large home, but it was mine. My husband and I had chosen it together many years ago, after years of renting apartments and living in temporary spaces. The walls had seen laughter, birthday cakes, Christmas mornings, and quiet afternoons when the sun streamed in just so. Every corner held a memory. Lena, my daughter, was always gentle and careful. Even as a child, she noticed the small things, the way the curtains needed straightening, the way the dishes lined up in the cabinet. She carried that care into adulthood, soft-spoken, cautious, often placing the needs of others before her own. Derek, my son-in-law, had a different energy. He was confident, sometimes too much, a presence that filled the room before he even spoke. I liked him at first. Who doesn't want a strong presence in their family? But over the years, his confidence often turned to control. I lived quietly, quietly enough that my own voice often went unheard. The first few years after my husband passed were lonely but peaceful. I learned to move around the house without disturbing the rhythm of my own thoughts. I cooked, I cleaned, I paid bills, and I watched the seasons pass. I thought I had learned patience. I thought I had learned endurance. When Derek and Lena moved in, I wanted to help. I wanted my daughter to have a partner she could rely on, someone steady, someone who would care for her as I had always cared. I gave them space in the house, adjusted my routines, and watched the subtle changes in our family life. At first, it seemed manageable. They were courteous enough, polite enough, but small things began to shift, almost imperceptibly. I noticed the first signs of tension in minor ways. Derek would leave cups on the coffee table, lids off, crumbs scattered, and never notice. He would turn the volume on the TV so high that I could not hear the phone ringing. Lena would apologize for things she had no reason to apologize for, her eyes pleading, her voice soft. I smiled through it, pretending not to see the imbalance. Pretending made it easier. The living room became a battleground in tiny ways. Derek would rearrange the furniture without asking. He would claim spaces, chairs, corners, the television as his. And Lena, she learned to shrink herself. Her warmth, once bright and open, now dimmed as she moved around the house like a shadow. I watched, quietly, letting her shrink to avoid conflict. I thought perhaps this was love in action, compromise, patience. I thought perhaps this was what family meant. I would sit in my armchair, the green velvet I had purchased with my first Social Security check, and simply observe. I told myself it was for peace, for harmony. I told myself that silence was a small price to pay for family. Yet each day the silence left a heavier weight on my chest. Each day I realized the life I had once known was slowly vanishing, replaced by the fear of small eruptions, loud words, slammed doors, sharp tones. Even the kitchen, my sanctuary, changed. Where I once cooked with joy, now I measured, calculated, careful not to disturb. I prepared meals that they requested, leaving the parts I loved for last. The burnt edges of the pie, I ate them. The center, the soft, sweet part, always went to Derek. I reminded myself that patience was a virtue, that love required sacrifice, that family required giving. But slowly a quiet clarity began to form. I noticed the patterns, the ways they moved through the house as if it were theirs alone. Derek's voice, firm and loud, commanding attention. Lena's soft mutters, careful apologies, efforts to keep him calm. I realized that while I had been patient, they had been entitled. While I had given, they had taken. While I had cared, they had expected. I began keeping small records, notes in a notebook, receipts, statements. At first I thought it was unnecessary, a precaution in case of a future argument. But the act of writing gave me clarity. I noticed the expenses they didn't contribute to, the bills I paid that supported their lifestyle, the quiet ways in which my presence had been taken for granted. It was not anger, not yet. It was awareness. I remembered the first real confrontation. Derek had come home, tired from work, and immediately demanded control of the TV. I had been sitting in my armchair, knitting, listening to a gentle classical station. He snatched the remote. "Turn that off. I want to watch the game." Lena's eyes darted to mine, as if asking for intervention. I said nothing. The silence in that moment was heavy, filled with every unspoken word we had buried over the years. From that day, I realized something crucial. Respect in this house had been replaced by assertion. The living room, the kitchen, the family table, they were mine, but no longer felt like mine. My home was mine, but my voice, my presence, my peace had been taken silently over time. I understood then that patience without action was dangerous, that quiet endurance could not protect me from entitlement. And so I began planning quietly, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. I could not continue to shrink myself in the very house that carried my life's memories. I needed order. I needed boundaries. I needed recognition of the truth that this was my home, not a playground for control. The first step was small, reclaiming my own space, a drawer here, a chair there, a gentle assertion that I existed. I bought small, quiet reinforcements, lamps, rugs, something subtle but firm, a reminder to myself that this house was my anchor and I would no longer drift into the corners. In those weeks, the pattern became clear. Derek would push, Lena would retreat, and I would observe, silently gathering information, calculating my next steps. I learned their schedules, their habits, the rhythms that governed their presence, and I waited, as one waits before the tide turns, knowing the moment to act would come with clarity, not noise. It was not a sudden realization. It was the gentle, steady accumulation of small truths, that family respect could not be assumed, that patience could not replace boundaries, that silence without action could be swallowed up by entitlement. And in that quiet, reflective awareness, I found a strength I had forgotten I possessed. This was the foundation. The stage was set. The house, the family, the patterns, they were all visible now, and I knew, quietly but surely, that the time would come when calm action would speak louder than years of silent endurance. I returned to the house that evening, the sunlight soft across the living room, but it no longer felt like mine. Derek was sprawled on the sofa, tossing the sports magazine onto the coffee table without even looking at me. Lena hovered in the kitchen, her movements small, careful, like she was trying not to be noticed. I carried my cup of tea slowly to the armchair by the window. The green velvet had faded slightly over the years, but it still held the warmth of memory. I sat and let the quiet settle around me, the ticking of the kitchen clock louder than usual in the sudden emptiness between us. Derek sneered. "You're back," he said. No greeting, no small talk, just a statement. I nodded, as though the words were simply a fact, not a challenge. Lena glanced at him, then at me, caught in the tension between us, the silence thick. The next morning, I woke to the sound of voices downstairs. Derek was on a call, sharp and commanding. Lena at his side, whispering suggestions, nodding. I could hear the rhythm of their routine, a rhythm I had once known but had slowly stopped following. I brewed coffee and walked slowly to the living room, letting the smell of the roast fill the air. I set my cup on the table. Derek looked up, a flash of annoyance in his eyes. "You're watching TV again?" he said. "The living room is mine now." I smiled quietly, took a sip of coffee, and did not answer. Words were no longer important. The papers in my drawer still held weight. They were quiet, patient, immovable, like me. Later that day, small tensions began to crack the walls of civility. Derek left a pile of his laundry on the couch. Lena did not pick it up. The dishes from breakfast were stacked in the sink. I moved them silently, the clink of plates punctuating the emptiness. I realized how much of myself I had given, how often I had swallowed my own feelings to keep the peace. I sat by the window again, watching the sunlight turn gold on the hardwood. I thought about the years I had shrunk myself in this house, eating quietly, watching quietly, paying quietly. It had been easier than fighting, easier than asking for respect. But the quiet had come at a cost. The cost was the erasure of my presence in my own home. One evening, Derek came home with a new sense of entitlement. "I bought a sound system," he said, as if announcing a conquest. "Set it up in the living room. You'll have to move for a while." Lena glanced at me, and my heart ached for her silence. I knew the weight she carried, the love for her husband, the fear of conflict, the guilt of taking sides. I said nothing. I moved to my room, opened my drawer, and let my fingers trace the edges of the papers I had kept for years. The deed, the bills, the documents, they reminded me that while I had been quiet, I had not been powerless. The reminder brought a strange calm, a quiet courage I had not felt in decades. Days passed in the same rhythm, small slights, hushed whispers, doors closing a little too hard. The house felt alive with tension. I would hear Derek laughing loudly on a conference call, Lena apologizing softly, and I would sip tea in my chair, observing. My own heartbeat became the measure of calm I clung to. One evening, Lena spoke quietly as I walked past the kitchen. "Mama," she said, her voice trembled, "maybe we can just talk tonight." I paused, glanced at her, saw the fear in her eyes. "Talk," I said gently, "is welcome when it comes from respect, not from fear, not from habit, not from pretending the rules don't exist." She nodded, a small, tentative movement, and went back to the sink. Derek remained oblivious, absorbed in his world, unaware that each small act of disrespect was quietly building the walls between us. I realized then that the conflict was not sudden. It had been years in the making. Each small silence, each ignored gesture, each overlooked document had added weight. I had been patient, accommodating, forgiving. But patience, I understood, was not weakness, it was preparation. That night, I sat in my armchair, the soft hum of the heater in the background, and made a decision. I would not shout, I would not cry, I would act, quietly, firmly. The papers in my drawer were ready, and so was I. The following morning, Derek's arrogance returned in full force. He barged into the kitchen, coffee cup in hand. "Where's my breakfast?" he demanded. I smiled softly. "Breakfast is wherever you make it, Derek," and turned back to my tea. The simplicity of the words, the calmness of the tone, seemed to confuse him. Lena watched wide-eyed, finally seeing a strength she had only glimpsed at in flashes over the years. It was then I understood that conflict did not have to be loud to be real. It could be quiet, deliberate, precise, and sometimes quiet was stronger than anger. I closed my eyes, listening to the distant sound of traffic outside, the ticking clock, the low hum of the refrigerator. I felt the weight of the house settle differently now. I was still here. I had not left, and for the first time in years, I felt a quiet, simmering readiness. The small victories were invisible. The tension in the air was palpable, but silent, and in that silence I found clarity. I would wait for the right moment. I would move carefully, like a hand tracing the edge of a familiar table. The house would not belong to them forever, not if I had anything to say about it. And so the days passed, each one measured, quiet, reflective. I watched, I waited, I planned. The rising conflict was subtle, invisible to anyone who did not look closely, but for me it was undeniable. I had learned, painfully, that respect was not given, it had to be claimed. The day they left my house, the street felt strangely quiet. No arguments, no slammed doors, no hurried footsteps. Just the low hum of the city, the distant chatter of people going about their lives. I stood at the gate, keys in hand, watching the moving truck pull away. For 4 years, I had walked carefully around my own home, shrinking myself to avoid conflict. And now I could breathe fully. Inside, the rooms felt different. Empty, yes, but not lonely. The furniture sat in its natural places, undisturbed. The walls no longer seemed to close in. I ran my fingers along the kitchen counter, remembering the mornings I had made breakfast while suppressing irritation at the undercurrent of entitlement I had endured. The air smelled clean, fresh. My house finally belonged to me again. I moved through each room slowly, touching the rugs, straightening the cushions, opening the windows to let in the cool breeze. The sound of the city filtered softly, like a lullaby. For the first time in years, I felt the house listening rather than demanding. Lena had called earlier, her voice hesitant. "Mama, I'm sorry." There were no words beyond that, just a trembling acknowledgement. I could hear the strain of realization, the weight of consequences finally settling. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let the quiet of my own home speak for me. Sometimes silence teaches better than any lecture. By evening, I lit a small candle on the dining table. The soft flame flickered gently across the walls. I poured a glass of wine and sat down, feeling my shoulders relax. Memories of burned pies, triple utility bills, and silent dinners drifted like old shadows. But instead of anger, I felt relief. Not because of revenge, not because of victory, but because of order. Because finally, boundaries had been drawn, clearly, firmly, without hatred. I walked to the living room, the same green velvet armchair that had witnessed decades of life. I sat down, feet planted firmly, and exhaled. The room was mine. I allowed myself a small smile. No one could push me out again. Not by words, not by arrogance, not by entitlement. I had papers, yes, but more than that, I had clarity, calm, and strength. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Light streamed softly through the curtains, warm and gentle. I walked to the kitchen and brewed a pot of coffee. As I poured the steam into my cup, I realized something profound. For years, I had measured love in silence, in tolerance, in endless giving. And yet, love without respect had no value. Respect could not be begged for, negotiated, or stolen. It had to be given freely or not at all. I spent the morning cleaning, moving slowly, purposefully. Each sweep of the mop, each folded towel, each organized drawer was a meditation. I realized that reclaiming my home wasn't just about space or money, it was about reclaiming myself. Every corner of this house reflected years of sacrifice, and now it reflected choice, my choice. When Lena called again, I answered. "Mama, I understand now," she said softly. There was a hesitation, a vulnerability that had been absent before. "I know I should have stood by you. I should have spoken up." I didn't need to answer immediately. I let her words sink in, like a stone settling at the bottom of a calm pond. Finally, I said, "Lena, you're learning. That's enough for today. Life will teach you more in its own way." And then, for the first time in years, I felt peace. The peace that comes not from the absence of conflict, but from facing it with dignity and order, from standing firm without cruelty, from reclaiming what is yours, not for pride, but for survival and sanity. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. The city lights twinkled like distant stars, and I realized something. Strength is quiet. Power is calm, and the most important battles are often fought not with anger, but with clarity, patience, and unwavering boundaries. I looked at my reflection in the glass. The same face, yes, but steadier, softer, yet stronger. Not just a woman who owns a house, but a woman who owns her life, her choices, and her peace. And for the first time, I understood fully. Freedom is not given. Freedom is taken one careful, deliberate step at a time. The days after Derek and Lena moved out were quiet, almost meditative. No shouting, no slammed doors, no hidden resentments, just the gentle rhythm of life inside my own home. I wandered from room to room, taking in the emptiness, not as loneliness, but as space to breathe, to think, and to feel. Each step reminded me that this house, these walls, and this life were mine, not borrowed from anyone, not to be bargained for. I sat in the family room, the green velvet armchair welcoming me like an old friend. The sun filtered through the curtains, painting the room with warmth. I closed my eyes and remembered the years I had given, the patience I had extended, the silence I had kept. I realized then that giving endlessly without boundaries does not always bring love or respect. Sometimes it only teaches others that they can take without consequences, and sometimes it teaches you what you are truly capable of. I walked to the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of coffee, savoring the aroma. The simple act felt symbolic, almost sacred. This house had been a battlefield, a classroom, and a sanctuary all at once, and now it was calm. Each corner held memories, yes, but now they belonged to me in a way they never had before. I could fill them with new moments, small joys, and quiet afternoons without fear or tension pressing down. Lena called that evening. "Mama," she said softly, I just want to say I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much I let things slide, how much I let him take from us, from you." Her voice trembled, not in accusation, not in complaint, but in a raw honesty that had been absent before. I smiled softly. "Lena, life has a way of teaching lessons in the hardest ways. You learned what respect means, not just for me, but for yourself. That's what matters." There was a pause, then a small, understanding sigh on the other end. "I see that now. Thank you, Mama." And just like that, I felt a quiet closure, not a triumph, not a revenge, but an inner peace that could not be shaken. The house was mine, yes, but more than that, my boundaries, my dignity, and my choices were mine. I realized that life does not always hand you respect, love, or fairness. Sometimes you must claim them quietly and firmly, without drama, without hate, and without fear. That night I lit a small candle by the window and watched the city lights twinkle. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth sink in. I realized that true strength is gentle. True power is calm. True freedom is measured in quiet decisions, not loud arguments. And the most important lesson I had learned, the one I hope Lena carries with her, is this: love and family matter, but they are never more important than your own peace and self-respect. As I turned off the light and settled under the comforter, I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. Sleep came easily, not just because I was tired, but because I was finally free. Free to live, free to choose, free to exist fully in the space I had earned. And in that freedom, I found joy. Not loud or dramatic, but steady, warm, and enduring, the kind that does not fade no matter what storms may come. Tomorrow, the house would be quiet and ready, but tonight, it was more than walls and furniture. It was a home reclaimed, a life restored, and a lesson quietly learned. Your peace is priceless. Your boundaries are sacred, and sometimes saying no is the most loving thing you can do for yourself and the people who truly matter. I closed my eyes, listened to the soft hum of the city, and let myself rest. Finally, At last, I was home.